particle で and え. In this lesson, you will be able to explain actions with directions and means. For example, バスで学校へ行きます。I go to school by bus. Particle で Particle で has many meanings. But in this lesson, we'll study で for places and で for means. で for places. 私は I レストランで at a restaurant 食べます eat 私はレストランで食べます The particle で shows that restaurant is the place where I eat. So this sentence means I eat at a restaurant. 私はレストランで食べます。で for means 私は I スマホで on a smartphone 新聞を newspapers 読みます read 私はスマホで新聞を読みます。で shows that スマホ smartphone is the means to read newspapers. So this sentence means I read newspapers on a smartphone. 私はスマホで新聞を読みます。Particle え Particle え shows direction. This letter originally represents he sound, but when the letter he is used as a particle, it is pronounced e. Particle e. 私は I 海へ to the sea 行きます go 私は海へ行きます The particle e indicates that I am going towards the sea. So this sentence means I go to the sea. 私は海へ行きます。Using de and e together. バスで by bus 学校へ to the school 行きます go バスで学校へ行きますで show the means to go to the school え show the direction to go and the subject is often omitted in Japanese sentences. So this sentence means I go to the school by bus. バスで学校へ行きます。Example sentences 弟 younger brother 家 house 勉強 study する do 弟は家で勉強します。My younger brother studies at home. 弟は家で勉強します。お父さん father 車 car スーパー supermarket 行く go お父さんは車でスーパーに行きます。My father goes to the supermarket by car. お父さんは車でスーパーに行きます。妹 younger sister 飛行機 plane 妹は飛行機で東京へ行きます。My younger sister goes to Tokyo by plane. 妹は飛行機で東京へ行きます。The next lesson is ますか、ません questions and negatives of verbs. See you in the next lesson.